Good evening, blog viewers. Tonight we'll go back to the virtue of courage, which we have not discussed. Again, these are one of the virtues that some virtues we have blogged about quite extensively. Other virtues have been left sort of neglected. And in this month of August, this slowest and quietest month of the year, I thought we would look back at some of the virtues that have not gotten the proper attention and get them teed up for a good fall and winter, where we will continue examining the virtues. Now, courage is one virtue, I think, where common, ordinary conceptions that we hear day to day in daily conversation in a bar, in a cafe, in a restaurant, in conversations with friends, common, ordinary notions are not too dissimilar from philosophical definitions or discussions of the virtue. True, the philosophical discussions are sometimes more elaborate, more elegant, more eloquent, but more or less, I think, on this issue, there is some unanimity there in the sort of the common conception of courage and sort of the philosophical conception of courage. Now, most people, I think of courage as the ability for a human being to have the sort of intestinal strength and fortitude to actually do what is right. To not let fear get in the way of doing what is actually good for us. Now, the uncourageous person obviously would fail to do a whole host of things in his life that he knows could perhaps improve it because he's scared of the consequences. He can't actually bring himself to do things that he actually knows is good for him. Interestingly here, because the uncourageous person is always so afraid of future consequences, in some ways we can say the uncourageous person is not only uncourageous, but he's somewhat foolish, because we can never predict the future. We can never predict what exactly is going to come about from a specific action. And so this heightened fear of future consequences is always somewhat foolish, because it's a fear of consequences that may never come about. We may fear that if we do action A, horrible consequences X, Y, and Z will happen, and because of that we don't do action A. But consequences X, Y, and Z never happen, or the belief, the very strong belief it would happen, is foolish, because again we can't predict it. So the uncourageous person is in fact unwise in some ways not to take that point seriously. Person is continuously blowing up certain fears in his mind, which will never happen, which may never come to act, which may never come about, and all of these exaggerated fears sort of prevent the person from doing what's right. Now, in this sense, again, in the modern conception, courage conquers fear, and again lets us do what is actually good for us and what will improve our lives. I think more specifically even than that, I think we could say courage is sometimes thought of as something or some quality of our soul, some quality of our personality that not only gets us to act, but allows us to maintain the action for as long as needed to bring it to a respectable conclusion point. Every action has sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. To persist in the action requires us to get from beginning to end smoothly without too many. Of course, there's always some detours, and there's obviously some failures along the way. But to get from A to B, from beginning, middle to end in a relatively competent, relatively decent, successful fashion, courage allows us to do that. It's not the action itself, which is sort of a complicated set of individual decisions in reality and actions in reality, sort of a whole bunch of sub-decisions that collectively form whatever it is, whatever plan we're seeking to execute. Courage is also not the mental decision to act. That's sort of some faculty of the mind, either sort of practical wisdom or some sort of intuition or some sort of habit that gets us to act. So courage is neither the action itself nor the mental decision. It's what actually gets us going to act and allows us to continue acting for so long as is needed to accomplish whatever it is we set out to do. Courage gets us through moments of uncertainty, moments of dullness as we are continuing to persist in the action, moments of fear, moments of doubt as to whether we've made the right decision. Courage, again, allows us to continue in that action, get to the end point. Consider, for example, someone that is miserable at work. This person rationally knows that this job is not at all good for him. it's causing his health to suffer, he's losing friends, he's miserable, doesn't really enjoy what he's doing, doesn't find the activity itself valuable or interesting or drawing upon many of his human faculties. This person, as a result of these observations over a long period of time, rationally decides he wants to quit this job and find a job that's better for him in many different ways. Now, courage is what would get this person to actually go into the boss's office and quit, deal with the consequences with friends and family, and then have enough fortitude and strength to find another job and begin the next job. That whole process from the minute the decision is made to quit till the end point, the new job, courage needs to sort of hover above that person throughout the whole time as he's continuing to act and get through to the end point. And now, at any point in this process, if the courage breaks down, at any point, person cannot execute the very well rational, thought out decision that was reached previously to quit the job. Either, for example, he turns back upon he's knocking at the office door of the boss. He turns back, doesn't go in, or he quits and then calls in the next day and says, "I changed my mind," or he begins to search for a job, can't find it, and then goes back to the job, or various other permutations. But whatever happens, whenever courage breaks down, the person sort of can't continue reaching the end point or the desired, rational, best decision for him or her that was made. So courage, again, now we can think of it as a very sort of strong, well-anchored bridge. It's a sort of a well-anchored bridge that takes us that allows us to go from the decision point to the completion of the action. Where I think courage is most necessary with respect to actions are those that take a long time to accomplish. You need sort of a very long bridge to get through this period, that this action or this plan that takes as comprised of many individual sub-actions that take a long period of time to actually complete. You don't quit your job and find a new one in a day. The process can take many months. If you decide to do something totally different that requires some sort of retraining or education, additional education of some sorts, it can take even longer. Same thing with decisions to start a new company or a decision to get married and have kids and form a family. All of these plans, all of these decisions about what's good for us, these require long periods of time, many individual decisions, and requires a persistence to reach the goal that I think we can think of as courage. Now, courage has actually, interestingly, long been conceived of as one of the key virtues of human life. In Plato's Republic, a book that we've talked about in several other posts, courage is actually listed as one of only 4 virtues for Plato. It was conceived of as that important in a human life. It was not at all a minor virtue. One of only 4 virtues discussed in the Republic was courage. The other 3 being moderation, justice, and sort of a philosophic, rational wisdom. Together, those things, in the Platonic conception, specifically in the Republic, the view was that if one had courage, one had moderation, one had justice, one had wisdom, then one's life would go rather well, or as good as could be expected in human life. And in books 3 to 4 of the Republic, we get a very critical and extended definition of the virtue of courage. And since it is a very extended but very meaningful definition, I want to read it in its entirety. This passage, I think, is in some sense one of the most beautiful and one of the most inspiring, in fact, of passages in the entire Platonic corpus. So I'll read it in its entirety. And it starts out at 429c. The city is courageous, then, because of a part of itself that has the power to preserve through everything its belief about what things are to be feared, namely, that they are the things and kinds of things that the lawgiver declared to be such in the course of educating it. Or don't you call that courage? I don't completely understand what you mean. Please say it again. I mean that courage is a kind of preservation. What sort of preservation? That preservation of the belief that has been inculcated by the law through education, about what things and sorts of things are to be feared. And by preserving this belief through everything, I mean preserving it and not abandoning it because of pains, pleasures, desires, or fears. If you like, I'll compare it to something I think it resembles. I'd like that. You know that dyers who want to dye wool purple first pick out from the many colors of wool the one that is naturally white. Then they carefully prepare this in various ways so that it will absorb the color as well as possible. And only at that point do they apply the purple dye. When something is dyed in this way, the color is fast. No amount of washing, whether with soap or without it, can remove it. But you also know what happens to material if it hasn't been dyed in this way, but instead is dyed purple or some other color without careful preparation. I know that it looks washed out and ridiculous. Then you should understand that as far as we could, we were doing something similar when we selected our soldiers and educated them in music and physical training. What we were contriving was nothing other than this, that because they had the proper nature and upbringing, they would absorb the laws in the finest possible ways, just like a dye, so that their belief about what they should fear and all the rest would become so fast that even such extremely effective detergents as pleasure, pain, fear, and desire wouldn't wash it out. And pleasure is much more potent than any powder, washing soda, or soap. This power to preserve through everything the correct and law-inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what isn't is what I call courage, unless, of course, you say otherwise. A very important passage here. There's a lot going on in it, but at bottom, what Socrates is saying here is that courage is sort of something that allows us to persist in the right course of action and not allow us to be not push us away from the right course of action as a result of some sort of pleasure or pain or fear or desire. This sort of virtue that we have, this courageous disposition, would allow us to sort of preserve in our action and persevere in whatever we think is right, all through all these different sort of side tracks on the way, whether pleasure or pain or fear. We would not at all allow any of these things to sort of take us away from our goal, our persevering in that goal. All of these things, because I think in the die example we get, it's been washed into us. This courage is such a part of our nature that it just cannot be washed out. It's just part of the intestinal strength and the courageous disposition is such a part of our being that it's just silly to think that anything like pleasure or fear or desire would get in the way of that. Someone with this sort of disposition would not fear, would not get sidetracked by fear because this sort of courageous disposition is washed in very deeply into his soul. And I think in many ways we can think of this as sort of a highway. Now, sort of the bridge, maybe using our past example, a very long bridge that has various exit points, whether one because of fear, exit 1 is fear, exit 2 is pleasure, exit 3 is some sort of desire that takes us off that path. But this courageous disposition, this die, is just so deep within that we ignore these exits, as tempting as they may be, as tired as we may become, as fearful as we become. We don't take the fear exit, we don't take the desire exit. We just continue in our acting in the way that we think is right, and in the way that is actually right. And I think this is a very beautiful and in many ways correct conception of what it means to be courageous. Now, I think in one of the earlier posts we wrote that courage is probably one of the virtues that is most lacking in modern times. And I think the breakdown in modern times of any strong conception of what it means to live a very fine life, to live well, to live justly, to live with wisdom, the breakdowns of any strong conceptions of what it means for someone to live in that way explains why courage is so often lacking. And I think we see it in this passage here in the Republic. Very few of us, I would say, very few of us have that die within us to allow us to persist in what we think is good. Even if we take actions, we have a lot of good ideas. I think everyone has a lot of good ideas about what's good for them or how their life could be improved. But the execution is always, or in many cases, is faulty, or the execution, we don't persist in the execution because we are always sidetracked by sort of this detour or that detour. We don't have the die within, we don't have the courage within to persist and reach the destination, so to speak. Now, this Platonic conception of courage, actually, I think, in important discussion in Book 4, it's usually allied with wisdom. It's not that Plato, I think, thought of as courage as an unmitigated virtue in whatever we were doing and whatever the action was. And I think he was very careful, Plato was, to have the discussion of courage always very closely allied with wisdom. And in that sense, you have to be pretty sure under this Platonic account that you are doing the right thing, that the correct die is within your soul, so to speak. If not, then your courage, then that's not courage. That becomes a vice where you're persisting very foolishly and very stubbornly, very aggressively, very methodically in a very foolish course of action if it's unallied with wisdom. But if it's allied with wisdom, if your decision is reached correctly, if it's a wise decision and it's actually good for you, then courage and this kind of die within you is actually one of the greatest of virtues, will allow you to reach your goal, will allow you to persevere, will allow you to accomplish the things that you think are good for you, and that wisdom has actually, or reason has actually blessed as good for you. Now, I think to end this post, we can think of an entire human life ultimately as evaluated, ultimately subject to evaluation by ourselves, first of all, by the collection of all of the actions that we take and our ability to persist in those actions that are actually good for us. We obviously all make mistakes. We sort of pursue various dead ends along the way. But at some point, when we get grown up and mature and think about what's actually good for us, we start to form pretty clear conceptions of what is actually good for us, and have good reasons for that too. And I think courage is key to allowing us to persist in those actions that we have thought of as good for us, and in that sense becomes a very important virtue of human life. Because if we're not able to persist, if we can't continue in our, or if we don't have the ability to make the necessary adjustments in our life and corrections and persist in those corrections, it would be very difficult for our lives to go rather well. So in that sense, perhaps in one of the earlier posts, we talked about perhaps using Aristotle's terminology, putting reason and creativity sort of at the head of the soul. But perhaps now we could throw in courage as well as one of the central virtues, and have courage, reason, and creativity sort of as the rulers of the soul, as the dominant guiding posts for a human life. Reason always being perhaps slightly ahead of everything else, because we fundamentally need to get things right as to how to live and what things to pursue in life, what to go for, and those decisions need to be rational, and those decisions need to be good for us. Of course, they can be good for us in different ways. Each person will have certain different things that are good for them in some way or another. But reason is important because we need to actually get the endpoints right. Creativity is important, critical, because as part of our self-creation, as part of our individual ways of doing things, as part of our bringing our uniqueness to life, creativity constantly refreshes life, constantly prevents the onslaught of boredom, which is always destructive of human life, which is always destructive of human good. Boredom is a thing that should be avoided at all costs, I would say. And so creativity acts as a key sort of refresher of life and a blocker of the vice of boredom. And then courage allows us not to get sidetracked when we've actually felt like we've hit the right formula and we've sort of determined what's right to go for. And in that sense, I think courage probably deserves to be at the very, very front rank of the soul as a key virtue that would allow us to live well. So on that, we'll end for today, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.